may work with a project that has maybe a staging server and a production server, for instance. It's nice to sort of not have to hard code these things in and these variables and have them set up in a nice way. So the first thing to get that going is we're just going to open up our pubspec.yaml, and we're going to search through to find our dependencies. And we're going to start by putting in a project called Flutter env, and let's just find that on pubdev. Sorry, flutter.env. So we'll go here and we'll go to installing, and we could just install it this way, but we'll grab the specific version, and we'll want to make sure that's in our dependencies as a sibling to Flutter, not within Flutter, but you know that. Okay, so now we have this, and then inside core, I'm going to just make a new file called env, or let's call it environment.dart. And what we could do is we could define a few different environments. So we'll make this as an underscore because it's not something we want to be able to access outside of this file. And these are the types of environments we might have. Maybe we have a development environment, we'll call develop, and then we have like a production environment. Keep it pretty simple right here. Also, we can just do it like that. And that's just telling me it's not used because, of course, it is not yet. We're also going to want to import in that .env, and we're going to import it like this, but I am going to cast it to as .env just so there's nothing, we know we're working with this package. All right, then what we can do here is we can set the environment. So we're going to go we're going to make a variable. It's not going to be a final variable. I'm going to see why in a minute. So it's of type env. And we'll call it env, and we'll just do environment.develop we'll start with. Okay, so now I'm going to make a class, and this will be the public part of this file, so we'll call it that. And the reason I'm just doing env instead of writing it all the way out is this is something we would use in multiple files. So we'll go like this, and we're going to want to make an initialization function here. It'll be a static function. In fact, this entire class is just going to be static, because it's not going to require instances of anything. So we will initialize it, and this will be an async function. And we'll start just by having a switch statement of env. Okay, so these are our two options right now. And what we would want to do is essentially we're going to have something called env path, which I'm going to make at the very top of the initialization function, string env path, and it's actually going to be a late variable because we're not going to initialize it right here, but we do want it to be final. And basically, if it's developed, we can essentially go env path equals, and we'll have a path for that one, and we'll have a path for this one. Okay, so what I want to do now is go into my assets folder, which we don't even have yet. So let's make a new folder called assets. And inside here, we're going to make another new folder called env. Oops, that was weird. And inside here, we are going to make one called develop_env and a file called production_env. Now, I do recommend that in our git ignore, we actually ignore those files. That way multiple devs can change these if you're working with multiple people. And it's generally good practice not to have your environment variables version controlled, even though this is a front-end code base and anything that's in an environment variable is not going to be secure. It's still a good practice to do that. So we're just going to go assets/env and ignore that. And you'll see these will change assets/env. You'll see they're no longer there. So here we can just type, if it's developed, we would do assets/env/develop_env. And here we would do the same thing, except for production_env. And then all we have to do at the very bottom of all this is we're going to do an await.env, and that's just the reference to the package .env. dot load, and we pass in a file name, and the file name is going to be equal to that env path. So when we initialize this, we basically check what do we have this set to, and get that going. Then what we can do, let's put something in here, and for environment variables, usually use uppercase. So we're just going to say maybe like API URL equals, and we could just do like http://localhost. And this is just an example. This can be, you can have many different types of things in here. So we'll do that. Maybe it's like /API. And then on our production one, we might have the same thing, but it might be, maybe it's a secure server and it's actually, mydomain.com/API, right? So we'll save those. Okay, so then the next thing that I like to do, because I don't want to, in my code base, have to access these specific things. It could lead to typos. It's nice to have anything that's like string-based really just in one spot. So what we are going to create now is some static classes that this one will return a string, and we'll make it a getter, and we'll call this API URL. And this is basically going to return, and to access that, we just go .env, .env, and this is the one place that will have that copy and paste of this. And we'll return a string. Now, this is actually returning it's not if we change this to this would work, and that's fine. But what we could do is also just set a fallback. So say that's missing from your environment variable, we can set a default just by having 2 question marks, and then maybe we take, our develop environment as sort of the default. That's one option. The other would be don't have a fallback and make it something that is nullable. It's just now in your code, you're always going to have to check if this is null. So I like this approach here. All right, so there we go. And in order to work with this now, I'm going to close some of these files. And let's go to our main.dart, where we sort of started doing things. And we have a scaffold here. So let's just, in the body, we'll put a center, and we'll put a child of text. And let's just make sure it renders. We should see that right in the center of the screen there. So we can simply get this by going env.api URL, and that will return it. So what I'll do is actually put this in here. Oh, it's because this is a const. This can no longer be a const, obviously. And we'll save this. And we just get this little non-initialization error. So let's actually do this now. So we're missing one thing. We actually need to initialize our environment. So we'll do that right in our main.dart. We can just go env.init. And what we'll want to do is actually await this so that nothing else happens. And that means we have to make this async. And the one other thing we have to remember to do is, because we created this assets folder, we need to go to our pub spec, and we actually have to go down to the assets section right here. So let's uncomment this. And we're just going to go assets/env/. And there we have it. So now if we were to go back to our environment, we could change this to production in this one spot. And we will have to rebuild for this because this kind of happens just at the original load, but we get our new environment variable there. So that's all great and works fine, but it does require you to make these changes here, which, if you're doing any kind of like continuous integration, deployment sort of things, or just run scripts to build, you might accidentally forget to change this and then deploy your develop one to production. Or vice versa. So what we're going to look into now is a couple of things we can do to mitigate that. First of all, in VS Code at least, we can go to this launcher tab right here, the run and debug, and we'll click this settings. And this is where we kind of have our different launch options here. So I'm not going to worry about, you can of course keep these, but just to keep it simple, I'm going to get rid of profile and whatnot. But let's do some settings here. So what we could call this is, let's call this development, or I'll call it Mac development. And let's just copy that and also make one for Mac production. And what I want to do here now is actually set some arguments here. So we can start by doing args, and we'll just let ChatGPT or a GitHub Copilot finish that for us, but that's not really what we want. Inside the args, we can do --dart define, and then in the next one, we can go env equals develop. And I'm going to copy and paste this for our production one. And then another thing we can do, just so that this launch configuration will always launch on Mac, we can, before this, let's just do -d, and we can just do Mac OS. And I'm going to duplicate all these one more time. And we can do the same for iOS, Android, anything like that, but we're going to do one for web develop and web production. And what we're going to change in the web ones is just make this say Chrome. So now in here, we would actually, once we've saved this file, we'll actually see these different options. And I have a typo here at least, and here. Let's make it look prettier, which just makes it easier for us to launch these things. Now, in order to make use of this variable in our environment file, we're going to go back to our environment right here. And what we'll basically be doing is we're going to create a variable, and it's going to be a const in this case, called env override. And it's going to be string.from environment. This is something you do in Dart to get an environment variable. And we're looking for that string env. And just to see what that is, that's literally this right here. So we have this, we now have this. And what we can do is we can check, that might be an empty string. So we need to check if env override dot is empty. Is not empty. Then we can check what it is. So let's do if env override is equal to, what do we have, develop. We would just want to force this env. So that's the reason this isn't a final variable. We essentially want to override it. And we're going to make it equal to environment.develop. And we can do else. So in order to test this, I'm actually going to stop the Mac application. And we'll go back to our launcher. And we have it set to production here. So let's actually launch Mac develop just by clicking this. And once it boots back up, we'll actually see that it's using that environment variable. Now, what about for, if you're doing this as in a script, some kind of continuous development? I'll show you how we could do that. We're going to make a new file. I like to use make files for these kind of things, but so we'll just call it make file. And let's make a an option called build Mac develop, we'll call it. And all we do here is go Flutter build, and we would want to do this Dart define thing. So we go Dart define env, or Dart define equals env equals. It's a little bit weird, but that'll work. Develop. Let me just close this guy so we can see the whole thing. And similarly, if we wanted to build for production, we could have this, and we'll just change the word develop to production. So simply now I can just go make sure I'm in my root directory and go make build Mac develop. And that way, even if I didn't change, and then we also set a small typo here. We don't use the -d when building, that's for running. And that's why I like to put these in make files, because you don't really have to think about them again. So if you now run make build Mac develop, and in case you don't want to make files, it's basically just running this command here. It's a lot easier to remember this than this whole command. And it's actually go and build it. And if we now copy this whole thing and just change it to production here, we'd be able to build that. And we don't have to wait for it to build. I assure you it will work. And we could do the same for web. We can just use the Dart define for these and do build web instead of Mac OS. So that's the first big tip, just kind of working with environment stuff and being able to override them in your both in your launch.jsons as well as in your your build scripts. All right, this next tip is relevant for Flutter Web. So sometimes you need to put things in your index.html file. It might be like a Google Analytics snippet or something for, some kind of snippet like that. However, you don't want to have to say you have like a development environment or a production environment and whatnot, and you have different API keys for that. You don't want to have to manage and copy and paste, these different files. So there's a cool tip in order to do this. Um, so what I'm going to do is we're going to go in our main.dart, and right now, just keep in mind, doing this the way I'm doing it right now will prevent this from running on Mac because we're just importing in, these sorts of things, and that is not going to fly. And you'll see in a tip in the future that will get a good way around that. So I'm just going to import these here, and what we can actually do is let's go to our, let's just update our environment a bit. I'm going to make a new, just to make this make more sense. Let's just call something called like analytics API key equals ABC123. And maybe in the production one, we make it DEF456. So there's our API keys, save all these files. Okay, and then in our environment, we are also going to want to set that. So we'll have a string, and let's actually make this a nullable string in this case, and it's going to be called analytics. Do we call it key? Analytics API key. So we'll just keep those names kind of the same. And in this case, we will allow this to be nullable just to see that, how that would work. Okay, so over here, what we're going to do is we are going to check, first of all, we want to see if our env.analytics API key does not equal null. Then we might run some extra code here. And what I want to run is I'm going to go js.context and pass in something, and we'll just call it analytics API key, for example, and we're going to make it equal to this right here. And maybe we also want to, it's to each their own, but maybe we also want to make sure that it is not empty. Dot is not empty, and I just forgot the couple things here, the ampersand, and we already know it's not null, so we can safely put a exclamation mark there. So we're going to set JS's context of the analytics API key equal to that value. And then we're going to go html.document.dispatch event. Okay, and we're going to do an html.custom event. And we'll just call this like Dart loaded, for instance. So basically when this starts up, it'll first get the environment variable. If it's not set, it's going to do something with this JS context, and it's going to dispatch an event saying, hey, we're loaded and ready to go. Now, back in our index.html, and I'm going to put this script, I'm going to make a script tag here at the bottom, do just a little bit of simple JavaScript. And what we're going to do is we're going to go document.addEventListener, and we want to listen to that event that we're firing, which is called Dart loaded. And it'll be a function. And inside this, let's just do a console.log of Dart code loaded, and let's console.log that API key. And how do we get that? Let me just do some JavaScript string interpolation here, which is pretty similar to Dart's in some ways, but we can go window dot, and it's whatever we called this value here. So the JS context goes onto the window object, so we'll actually be able to get it here. All right, so we're going to save that. And what we're going to do, we'll close down our Mac app, and we will use our web. Let's use our web develop. So we know stuff's working at least. That's great. So let's go to our console log right here, and we're actually going to see Dart code loaded and API key ABC123. Now, if we were to rebuild this using the production environment, I imagine it would say, whatever we made it, DEF456, but this is a way that we can essentially get this to our HTML file. And then, console logging isn't really that helpful, but this is where we might include, like our Google Analytics tag. So I'm not going to try and find a Google Analytics tag right now, but I have something pretty similar. So we can basically check, first of all, if window.analytics API key exists. So, and in JavaScript, that would mean it's not null and it is not an empty string. Let's see what there we go. We'll just use this, which this isn't actually going to work, but you might have a snippet like this. It might be, a Google Analytics tag that you can just then take this key and put it in to the variable. It might be something like segment, so on and so forth. There's many different ways, many different things you might be able to do with this, but it's just a way you can essentially get access to a Flutter / a Dart variable within your index.html. And I am using this on a couple projects right now. Okay, now the problem that we have created by doing this, which will segue us into the next thing, is if I actually try to build this for Mac now, which we will quickly do. Let's go Mac develop. We will get a major error because these variables do not work, or this types of functionality. And if we go here, you're going to see build failed, and it's all stuff to do with, hey, I can't, load. I don't know what this is. Like this means it makes no sense to me, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where creating mocks can be pretty helpful. And it's a little bit of a complicated thing, but it makes being able to build these cross-platform apps that need to access things like JavaScript for web, but can't do it for Mac and iOS and everything, makes it work. Okay, so I'm going to go inside our lib source, and let's do it right in core. And I'm going to make a new folder, and I just like to call this HTML helpers as just what I like. And we're going to create 4 files in here. So let's do that in terminal. It'll be a little bit easier. So we'll go cd lib source, cd core, cd HTML helpers. And here we're going to make these 4 files. So we're just going to touch them. And that's just a way to make a file. So touch HTML helpers. We're first going to create an interface.dart. I'm just going to copy that. Then we're going to make another file called HTML helpers .dart. Make another file called HTML helpers web.dart. And then the most important one, maybe, is mock.dart. The way this is going to basically work is it's going to allow us to dynamically, based on the platform, import in a different version of this file. But these 2 different ones, it'll be the web one and the mock one, they need to follow the same pattern for Dart and everything to compile, because it needs to know, what this class can do. So we'll start by making the interface, and let's do, so class HTML helpers interface. And the interface is kind of just like a blueprint of what this thing can do. So maybe one of the things is redirect might be one, which passes in a string of a URL. We also want to specifically make this an abstract class because it's not something we're ever going to work with directly. We're going to be working with the things that inherit it. So maybe we have a redirect, which is something you can really only do in web, like you actually want to redirect your page somewhere. Another one might be, what is going to help us before, and we'll call this like inject analytics API key. And that can just be a void function, I believe, with no parameters. So we set up kind of this, these are the things we need to conform to. So now let's open up, let's do the web one first, because this is where the real code will actually be. And what we're going to do is make something called HTML helpers implementation. And what it's going to do is it's going to extend HTML helpers interface. And we're getting these little errors here because it's saying, hey, you're missing some things. So we can actually click this and it will at least get us started here. So here's our 2 functions. I'm going to do them in the order that we made them. So for redirecting, so this is going to be our file that is only going to be opened when it is a web, when it is actually hosted in a browser. So we can safely import this in here. And for this, we can just simply go html.window.open URL, so that URL that gets passed in. And then if we pass as the second parameter self, it'll basically just redirect it on the page. This is just an example. So don't worry if you don't really know what that means, but it's just a way to basically redirect someone to a new site or a new page of a web application in the same tab. And then inject analytics token, we already kind of have that code for. If we go back to our main.dart, let's import this JS as well, because we'll need that. Oops, right here. And we'll basically take this whole code here, move it out, and it's going to go into here. And we need to import in the necessary file for this, which is this one here. Okay, so now we have the web version of this done. The next one we need to make is the mock version. So what I can do is actually, we want to keep this as the exact same name, and it's still going to extend this, so we need to import in that. And we can do this, and we want to create these. Now the intention here is this will never, this is code that is irrelevant to a native application. So really, we don't have to do anything, but we can just say like print not implemented for native, and same with this. And maybe this one we want to, also print the URL. So we now have our interface. We have the web version of that interface. Now here's where everything kind of comes together, is in our HTML helpers.dart. And what we're going to do is just go class HTML helpers. And this is the one we're always going to work with in our code base. And it's going to extend HTML helpers implementation. It's giving me two different options here. It's like, which one do you want? Well, that's the thing. We want it to be determined based on the platform that's running this. So what we can actually do is, these are all in the same folder, so we can make this pretty simple. So we want to load in the same file, HTML helpers web.dart. That's what we want to load by default. But if dart.library.io, we basically tell it, no, don't load that. Load HTML helpers mock.dart. So now this points to, one of the two things. It doesn't actually know until really the runtime, but this will allow us to essentially have this function, these functions kind of work without having compiling error. So in here, I would simply go HTML helpers dot inject analytics API key. So this right here will run this code because on web, but it will essentially just skip it out if you build to Mac. So let's try building again to Mac before we got that crazy error. Mac develop, sure. All right, and you'll see when this was booted up, we just kind of got this message, not implemented for native, which is what we expected in this example. And let's say that, maybe on here, we'll still keep this, but I'll put this in a column. And we'll make it main axis size dot min, and maybe we'll just have a text button that says something. Just make it say text redirect me. And here we would use that same HTML helpers dot inject, or that dot redirect, and maybe we go to https://youtube.com. So now if I click this redirect me button, I will get that error not implemented for native. But let's build this for web now. We'll stop the Mac one, and we will just build for develop. All right, so we're booted up on Chrome now. And you'll see here we got the, this function and API key. This is the stuff actually coming from JavaScript in the index.html. All right, so now if we click this, we'll actually go to youtube.com. Now, obviously, with this redirect example, which is just an example, you'd probably be able to do in the mock, something like you can use, there's a package called launch URL, and maybe you want to just launch it in a, in the browser or whatever. There's definitely, these don't necessarily have to just be for mocks. They can be for, a method for handling web versus native, which, for me at least, someone who's worked with Flutter web a lot, and also with having to support other devices, this is a key thing that I'm using all the time.